Very glad to welcome Professor Jelani Jefferson Exum here to campus. Professor Exum is a professor of law and Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Toledo. She previously taught at the University of Michigan, the University of Kansas, and was a Forrester Fellow and Instructor of Legal Writing at Tulane Law School. Before joining academia, Professor Exum served as a law clerk for the Honorable James L. Dennis, U.S. Circuit Judge for the Fifth Circuit of Appeals, and the Honorable Eldon E. Fallon, U.S. District Judge for the Eastern District of Louisiana. In addition to publishing numerous scholarly articles in law journals, Professor Exum has delivered a TED Talk, provided expert legal testimony to the District Court of Maryland, and has been called upon by the popular press to provide her expert legal opinion on topics ranging from the legality of electronic surveillance in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing to the Amanda Knox verdict. Here at the Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation, we are interested in covering how obscure and seemingly innocuous occupational licensing laws may be keeping individuals who made a mistake in their past from re-entering the workforce and beginning the path to becoming a contributing member of society. How do we strike the right balance to provide public safety, yet protect the rights of individuals? Is the criminal justice system fair, or does the treatment received depend upon the color of one's skin? These are complicated but important questions, and I'm so glad that we have an expert like Professor Exum here to better understand these issues. Please join me in giving a warm SFU welcome to Professor Jelani Jefferson Exum.
Thank you all so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk to you all. I'm glad that I'm getting the opportunity to talk in a small space to start, and so that we can really have a discussion and really just have a little bit of back and forth. I'll start by giving you, presenting some information to you all, but my hope really is to get a dialogue going and to answer questions and to get your own thoughts. So hopefully, as I'm talking, you can start to think about that as well. So thank you all for having me here today. I want to also thank my sister, Julia Jefferson Bullock. She's a professor at Duquesne Law School, for traveling down with me. So we drove down from Pittsburgh today. Thank you to Professor Timmons for the invitation, and just thank you to all of you for coming to talk with me. So for those of you who are planning to attend the talk tonight, you can think of this as a little bit of a sneak preview, right, of some of the information that I'll talk about. But I'll add more information tonight, a few other graphics and pictures and things like that. So this is a little teaser. So if you want to hear more, come on out tonight as well. So I'm going to be talking to you today about, or trying to engage you all in thoughts about sentencing, and really just thinking about our mechanism of punishment. In my view, what we're doing in sentencing law and policy really sends a disturbing message about our criminal justice priorities, or really lack of priorities. To me, it shows what little thought we really put into how we punish, why we punish, what are we actually trying to do. And so I think that when we look at punishment, at sentencing, our sentencing landscape in this country, we really see a reflection of ourselves, of our own values. And I think that if we take an honest look at that reflection, we're not going to really like what we see, and we can address that, right? We don't have to keep going the way that we're going. We can actually take some time, reflect, stop, and think about how to do things in a better fashion. Ultimately, I think that we really don't take the time to question what we're actually doing in punishment. We never really stop to look at ourselves, to take stock of what we're really doing. And so in my view, the consequences of this sort of purposeless punishment is that we end up overcriminalizing people, not offenses. So it ends up being that we have a certain view of who is a criminal, what does a criminal look like, and actually criminalizing these people rather than the offenses, and also facilitating a continued undervaluing of their humanity. So let me start you off with an illustration of what's happening across the country, across the United States. So prison systems across the United States are operating at anywhere from 90 to 140% over capacity. So as you can see, Pennsylvania has not escaped this trend. About a decade ago, the state's incarceration rate had gone up 40%, but this had started much earlier. So since 1982, the incarceration rate in Pennsylvania had increased by 280%. So we see a time in the 80s where there's really across the country, and I'm just showing you using Pennsylvania as an example, where in the 80s, incarceration rates just skyrocketed. And we can do a little bit more talking about why that's so during our Q&A. And so when you look at this, you might think, wow, the United States has a huge crime problem. We have so much crime that we can't even keep up with it, right? We can't incarcerate all of our criminals. This is a huge problem. And if you think that, then one solution would be, what? Build more prisons, right? Just build a few more prisons, and then we can finally keep up with this problem. And states have done that. So in Pennsylvania was just followed course as well. So for the last 10 years, there have been prisons that have popped up in different states. We've been relying on private prisons to deal with this overcapacity. And so that's been one possibility or one route that was taken. Now, of course, the problem ends up being money, right? And so we can keep trying to incarcerate people and keep building prisons, but at some point the money runs out. And so we're all stuck with thinking, okay, well, what should we do? How should we deal with this? My thought is that this is a perfect time where we can stop and think, why are we incarcerating so many people at all, right? Because the idea of building more prisons tells us or operates under the assumption that we think we need them, right? We need to be incarcerating people at this rate, that we do have this just through-the-roof crime problem, that prisons are the only way to deal with it. And I'd like us to think today about really the falsity of that and the ultimate consequences of that. So if we think about what do we actually need to do, what should we do, what are we trying to do, looking over sort of the history and the type of work that I do, which is really all about sentencing purposes and thinking about marrying purposes with actual practice, we'll find that there's never been any legislature, no sentencing commission, has ever actually honestly explained, here's our goal for this particular offense or set of offenses. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And if we can't do that, or if we don't do that, then we can never measure if we're being effective. So for instance, if we say that our purpose is to rehabilitate, let's just take a class of offenders, drug offenders, for instance. This is, by the way, I'm going to talk tonight about drug offenses and sort of the story of the war on drugs in more detail. So that's to come. But if we take drug offenses and we say that our purpose is to rehabilitate, right? We're hoping that people go through their punishment, come out as better people, and don't commit these drug offenses in the future. But if we're actually doing that, then it would make sense to study if our current sentencing laws are accomplishing that goal, right? Are we actually seeing reduced recidivism? The answer, by the way, is no. Through our sentencing practices, through our length of incarceration. And so if we're honestly dealing with those purposes, we'd stop, we'd test them, and then we'd regroup if we find that our sentencing isn't doing that. My argument is that we actually aren't honest about our goals and purposes, which is why we never take stock, which is why we don't meaningfully reform. And so instead, the thought is to continue spending money, filling up prisons, and when they're all full, just build some more or contract out to private prisons. So as I explained through my scholarship, I'm trying to think of ways to incorporate purposes and goals of sentencing, and that I've come to the conclusion that we just haven't been honest about these goals. And so I'd like to talk to you all today about the consequences of that sort of default to incarceration, what it's doing not just fiscally, but really to the individuals involved. So it's often said that the United States is only 5% of the world's population, yet holds 25% of the world's prisoners. And so if you take a look at this graphic, you'll see that the United States is the world leader in incarceration. But take a look at our neighbors. So United States, there we are, number one, yay, U.S., right? Right next to Russia, Cuba, Iran, Israel, right? And so when we're taking a look at our cohorts there, they're typically countries that we try to distance ourselves from ideologically. But there we are as the leader in incarceration today, and it's been this way for quite some time. There are currently about 2.3 million Americans in prisons and jails throughout the country, and then another 7 million under some sort of correctional control. And so if you take all of that right now, today, a little bit more than 25%, so a quarter of the U.S. population has a criminal conviction. And, in light of what this center does, this, of course, has collateral consequences with people convicted of felonies not being able to vote in some instances, about barriers to occupational and professional licenses, barriers to housing, to government services, all sorts of things that come. And so if you think about that being 25% of the country and really growing, then that's quite staggering. So as I said, in my talk tonight, I'll focus more on the drug sentencing aspect, but I'm going to skip that and talk to you really about the people underlying these statistics. And to do that means that I have to confront the uncomfortable topic of speaking about race. When it comes to the criminal justice system, we really can't get past racial disparities, racial injustices, and so let's just do it, right? Let's just get there and talk about race. So while African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, Blacks comprise 37% of the U.S. prison population in this country. I like to pause there because I do think that it's important to note that if African Americans comprise 37% of the U.S. population, the rest of the U.S. prison population, the rest of the U.S. prison population is white, and that's something that we don't always think about. We talk about disparities, but when you think about this, quarter, 2.3 million people, it is mostly white, but it's disproportionately African American, because African Americans are only 13% of the population in the country. If you keep going at our current incarceration trends, who can be expected to be incarcerated in their lifetime? Well, we get 1 out of every 3 Black males born today. Let these numbers sink in a little bit. 1 out of every 6 Latino males born today. So we see the racial disparities. 1 out of every 17 white males born today. I would say that all of these numbers are bleak, right? They're shocking. 1 out of every 17, that's not something to celebrate, right? But if we look at 1 out of every 3 Black males, then the numbers really are just depressing. And so I think it's important to think about the numbers behind, the people behind these statistics. When we focus on racial statistics in this way, I call these bias bolstering statistics because they give us a certain view of the criminal justice system that is mostly Black, mostly of lower income, and so sort of gives us this idea of who the criminal is, who actually is deserving of punishment. But if we keep going through and talk a little bit more, give a little bit more of the story, then we can get to what I call bias revealing statistics that really talk about what's going on in the criminal justice system. Before we get there, let's just pause to think about what people make of those first numbers that I just showed you. So when polled about perceptions of fairness in the criminal justice system, the question was posed, this was a Gallup poll done a few years ago, is the American justice system biased against Black people? The answer that Blacks gave, 68% said yes, 26% said no. But to show you where we are in this country when it comes to racial division, whites were exactly the opposite, almost exactly, with 25% of whites saying no and 69% saying yes. So if you take the statistics from my previous slide and you're somebody who thinks, well, I don't think that there's this race-based bias in the criminal justice system, and the question is, what story do you tell yourself about why there's such racially skewed numbers as there are, right? Is it a feeling or an assumption that, well, there's just crime problems in Black communities, there's just crime problems in these communities, and that's why it looks that way? And this is why I like to show what I call the bias revealing statistics, which gives us a bigger picture. So here's one. 30% of African Americans were sentenced to jail for misdemeanor offenses when compared to people of other races convicted of the same type of crime. 20% of Hispanics were sentenced to prison, 16% of whites. So we take the body of people all sentenced for the same type of offenses, we get this racial dimension to it. And these numbers, so the next two that I'll show you, are pretty staggering to me. African American offenders were 89% more likely than white offenders to be jailed for misdemeanor person offenses. So we're thinking about things like assault. This is compared to other offenders who have committed the same type of crime. So one set based on race is getting a break while the other set is not. And then African American offenders were 85% more likely than white offenders to be incarcerated for misdemeanor drug offenses. Again, whole set of people, offenders committing of these crimes, and then we see a racial skew when it comes to who's actually being put in prison for the crimes. So when we think of this whole story, then we have to stop and ask ourselves, well, why do we have this, right? What's at play? What's going on when we have a whole body of offenders? Why do we see punishment being doled out differently? And this is where some of the questions of my work come in, which is, well, if we've never thought that we're punishing because of rehabilitation or in order to make sure that the most dangerous offenders are incarcerated, or even community notions of retribution, so we're actually assigning blame properly, then all we're left with is that we have a system that punishes more severely based on somebody's race. And if we stop and take stock of that, that should feel uncomfortable to everyone, right? And we should be thinking, well, can we do better than that? And I definitely think that we can. Now, in trying to figure out what's behind this, why do these numbers look this way, of course, we could just talk to sort of, explicit racist beliefs. So, they're there. We see this in the news, right? So we know that there are people who hold those beliefs. But researchers today have really been focusing on implicit bias as a big driver of racial disparities in our criminal justice system. So just to tell you what this is, it describes the cognitive processes whereby, despite even the best intentions, so this means, you are trying to do the best you can. You're trying to make the most even judgment that you can, people automatically classify information in racially biased ways. When you go through taking, there's this implicit bias test. Has anybody done that, by the way? You can Google it. Google Harvard implicit bias test, or might be called implicit association test. Either way, it's going to come up. Take the test, and you're going to find that you fall into these categories, right? When we focus it on Americans, the majority of Americans tested carry implicit negative attitudes toward blacks and associate blacks with negative stereotypes. This is, by the way, across all races, so even including black people. Now, I don't have enough time. Let's check my time just so okay. Yeah, definitely don't have enough time to go through where all of this is from. But, it's our legacy of slavery, Jim Crow segregation. It's something that even, the civil rights victories of the 1960s couldn't erase. This is sort of, the stuff that we've all come up in, right? We get to media and songs and TV and movies and all that. So it's ingrained in us. But when we take it to the criminal justice system, researchers are now trying to look at prosecutors, judges, law enforcement, jurors, basically any place in the system where a person's decision comes into play, and they're finding implicit bias at play in those instances. And so those are going to go to the detriment of black defendants. So, like I said, this has been, something that's been ingrained in us for hundreds of years. There's no reason to think that we're going to wake up tomorrow, now that we've all heard of implicit bias, and it's going to go away, right? It's in us. We have to take stock of it. We have to understand it. And there have been some strides. Police departments, prosecutors' offices, even judges have been doing implicit bias training to, and I don't want to say it's completely widespread. This is sort of hit or miss in different jurisdictions. To just kind of, put themselves on notice and to try to figure out ways to overcome this. But it's here with us. So when we think about sentencing, then what can we actually do, knowing that this is here, that this is in play, to have a more just, a more fair sentencing system? And I believe that as long as we continue to have incarceration disparities, as long as we continue to have those bias bolstering statistics, that really just feeds implicit bias, right? Because we still see the same people cycling through the system, we still have the same image. But if we can stop and actually think about what we're trying to do and tailor sentencing to sentencing outcomes, then we have a better chance of having more honest sentencing and dealing with some of the disparities as well. So just talk for a bit more, and then I really want to just get your impressions. Really want to know, how much of this is new information, how much of it is not, and sort of where you've put it in your mind in this whole story. So when we think about sentencing purposes, we have a few that we can choose from. There is, and maybe I should ask you all, anybody familiar with theories of punishment? Not my sister, she teaches this stuff. Theories of punishment. Well, let me ask you this way. When you think about why we punish, just throw out some reasons. You don't have to use fancy words. Just why do you think we punish people for criminal offenses? What's the point?
Rehabilitation.
Okay, and that's a theory of punishment. Okay, all right, you can be the real word.
I was going to say rehabilitation.
Okay, yeah, so you're thinking, so rehabilitation, that theory says you're punishing someone in order to change them. So during their punishment, they're going to change into a better law-abiding person. We let them out, we're all good to go, right? There's retribution. You said retribution is measuring society's view of moral condemnation, basically. So telling the person, we don't like what you did. This thing you did was bad, and you need to take a time out, right? And then because we're showing you that we all think it's bad, and then you can come back to us. It's not really about changing the person. It's more about signaling our displeasure, right? But that has to be tied to the length of time. So if you think it's just a little bit bad, you send them away for a little bit of time. If you think it's really, really bad, you send them away for a lot of time. Does that a hand in the back or just stretching?
Yeah, is prevention reason?
Okay, and so prevention, if you're thinking about like them not doing it again, so in sort of theory speak, we call that deterrence. The thought of we're punishing you so that you'll think, oh, I really hated that experience. I'm never going to do that again, right? So I'm going to prison for stealing a car so that, I reflect on that. When I come out of prison, what deterrence says is I might not be a better person, right? I might walk past cars and think all the time, man, that's a good one. Like, I could get that one. But I'm not going to do it because I didn't like that prison experience. So that's deterrence. I'm missing one. Incapacitation is the other. And that one is about violence and dangerousness. So basically saying we have to put away this person because they're dangerous, they're violent, they're harmful to the rest of us. And so we put them away for a period of time, almost like we're giving society a break. I mean, I talked about retribution being like the offender gets a timeout. For incapacitation, it's like we're getting a break. We're getting a breather from them and their dangerous ways. So the gist of what I'm saying is that we have a system with bias. We have a system with injustices. We have a system with a lot of stuff that could be better. But one way that we really could get better is just identifying exactly what we're doing. So we can talk about all of these purposes just sort of floating in the air, but if we don't sit down and ever look at our actual sentencing outcomes and we say, okay, when we sentence offenders to X number of years in prison, what are our statistics saying? Are they showing us that we're actually deterring crime at this rate? Are they showing us that we're actually rehabilitating offenders? Whatever our goal actually is, are they lining up with polls and studies about how society feels about this particular crime? On all those measurements, we're way off track, right? We don't have any evidence of our incarceration rates deterring crime, being in line with retribution, certainly not rehabilitation, and we have lots of instances, and the drug offenses are one of them, where we see low-level offenders being incarcerated at higher rates than our high-level offenders. So it's out of line with incapacitation as well. So that's what I mean by thinking about purposes as a way to combat some of these systemic problems. And, in all of this, by not doing that, I've already explained that this is over-criminalizing the person. Right? So these are individuals that end up being, basically bearing the weight of us just not putting in the effort to care more about our criminal justice system. But it really undervalues them as well. And so we can see that through our community consequences. So if we think about our high levels of incarceration, and we see some racial disparities here as well, African American children are 7 times more likely than whites to have a parent in prison. Latino children, 2.5 times more likely. There are hosts of studies about the detrimental effects on children of having incarcerated parents. But look at this one. The risk of parental imprisonment by the age of 14. So a really key point in life. For white children, 1 in 25 white children will have a parent in prison by the age of 14 at our current incarceration rate. Black children, 1 in 4. I mean, that's really, really a huge impact. And so if we don't take stock of the consequences of our purposeless punishment, we're not just over-criminalizing people, we're undervaluing whole communities, whole groups of families, and really we're undervaluing ourselves, because as this grows, it will end up touching more of us than we actually think. And so I'll stop by just getting to giving you an outline of my proposal, the sorts of things that I talk more about in my work, and it's about purpose-focused punishment as a tool to fight over-criminalization. And so I've already touched on most of these. One is identifying purpose. So what I'd actually like to see is in state laws to have an articulation of the purpose for that particular criminal offense and accompanying punishment, that the goal is to do X. That way, when judges are making decisions, they can have that in mind as they're figuring out the proper punishment. And then to reassess effectiveness. So if we have purposes, let's actually study and think about whether they're actually getting to those purposes. This is then going to require experimentation. We can't continue to just rely on incarceration as our default mode of punishment. There's lots of evidence that shows that incarceration doesn't rehabilitate, for example. And so if rehabilitation is going to be our goal, then we can't just use incarceration to reach that. And this feeds into that next bit, which is in this experimentation, recognizing that incarceration and really even thinking about what we criminalize in the first place are usually not effective, and be willing to use alternative approaches. Sometimes these might even be mixes of non-punitive approaches. So because I said we were going to get to talk, I will stop there. Thank you so much, and I'm really excited about hearing your thoughts on this. Thank you. So any questions in the room? Yes.
So I know that you're going to talk later much more about the drug offenses and things like that. My community is predominantly white, and we have, if I remember correctly, at the time I just left, we have 3 black families. And just to produce this statistics correctly, all 3 of those families, the parent is missing due to some criminalized behavior. When I know plenty of families in town who have also been busted for those things who haven't been to jail.
Yeah.
Which is, right. It's very hard because like in our area, especially in Pennsylvania, it's, I guess a lot of like our communities are predominantly white, and we see these things happening, but the ideology in my town almost promotes it and pushes for it because nobody appreciates those people.
Yeah, and so that's, thank you for that. That really gets to the undervaluing part, right, which I think is really important. I think they go hand in hand. The more that we overcriminalize, meaning that we overuse our criminal justice system, right, because there may be instances where somebody has committed a crime, and everybody knows they've committed a crime, you're able to show that, but you still think that the criminal justice system is too harsh of a place for them. And we see this play out time and time again. That's the story behind what you're saying is happening in some of the white families, right? Where we say, let's find other avenues. Let's have other ways to deal with this that people of other races are not getting the benefit of. And so we already have ingrained in us, we already have this practice of not always using the criminal justice system. So when you overuse it, that's the overcriminalization. And what is its twin is undervaluing, right? That what you're doing is saying, for this group, we just don't really care that much. It's, to me, when you really take stock of it that way, not only should it feel uncomfortable, but it also is something that you can change, right? You can stop and say, okay, let's handle this differently. Let's approach let's take our approach to punishment differently. It doesn't have to be what we do. It doesn't have to stay the way that we do things now. But thank you for that. So you see, you get a real life example of bearing out what these numbers say. Anything else? Yes.
So following this model of purpose-focused punishment, what can be said? Say a state decides to go with rehabilitation for a particular crime, and then perhaps they're on probation and go through different rehabilitation programs. What if those rehabilitation programs are ineffective? Like ARD, for example, is not a successful program in every state. So would state legislators then have to change the language to change the purpose if it's not rehabilitation, something else?
So I don't think so. I think that, let's just take your example. We say we have this crime. The purpose is rehabilitation. The point of that really is to put all of our efforts into trying to figure out how can you actually rehabilitate for this particular type of offense and offender. We might run into some situations where the answer is no. We might run into situations where we say, we can figure out how to do this. We might find that rehabilitation isn't our best model for certain types of offenses. Right now, let's put it this way, if that were the ultimate endpoint, right, we say, we've tried different things, this isn't working, rehabilitation isn't working for this offense, then yes, you change. And I think that's appropriate, right? Legislation is supposed to change, it's supposed to adapt to reality, and I don't see any problem with that. But I do think that it'll make us more sophisticated in how we punish. And so, for example, right now, rehabilitation is sort of the big thing to talk about with drug offenses, right? Especially people who commit drug offenses who are actually addicted to drugs. And so in a lot of jurisdictions, we have drug courts now that have been popping up. And I think that's great, right? Using drug courts is great. They have a lot of success. It depends on how they're set up, but many of them have a lot of success. Certainly more than just putting people in prison, right? We see more success in the drug courts. The problem with the way we have it set up now, however, is that rehabilitation is only a drug court priority. It's not an offense priority. So most people who have drug offenses do not get the benefit of drug court. We just sort of cherry pick them, right? So some of them can. If we change our thinking and we say for drug offenses, for people who are addicted to, who have some sort of drug addiction problem, our main priority is rehabilitation, then we reinvest out of prisons into the programs that do this kind of work. And that's the kind of big changes that I would ultimately love to see. There's a lot of barriers in the way to that we can talk about. But yeah, so I think that it's perfectly legitimate to identify a goal and to change course if it's later found that this isn't happening. I'll add one more thing to that. This is also, by the way, not based on just one offender, but instead of statistics about the group of offenders. So just having rehabilitation failures for 1 or 2 people or more, 1 or 200,000 people, that to me doesn't mean you failed at the goal. It just means those individuals didn't benefit. But if statistics are bearing out that for the most part people are actually changing course in life, then that to me is a success.
The statistics you shared, I mean, they really gave me pause. I mean, it's hard to believe that the system is unfair as those statistics bear out. I was just curious if those statistics vary on a state-by-state basis. I mean, is there one state we can look to as maybe doing some things better?
Star.
Yeah. Or are there other countries? I mean, are there countries that use different approaches?
Right, good question.
We can borrow from.
Yeah, and I should say, usually I'm trying to not just like knock people over the head with statistics. They can get pretty heavy and too much.
Right, I love them.
But yeah, maybe I'm in a crowd that is good with that. I don't know. But most of these statistics come from the U.S. Department of Justice. So this is the Bureau of Justice Statistics. That's a part of the U.S. Department of Justice. That it's their job to just pull together data from across the country. So reliable sources. That's where it comes from. But there is a difference based on jurisdiction. So everything is very regional in this country. The types of crimes that you will find mostly coming before courts varies depending on where you are. Sort of even just the racial makeup of that area changes. And so all of this does there are kind of regional variations. However, what we find these disparities across the country, just in different rates. But they are everywhere. There are some states that are models at certain types of things. So not across the board like, hey, this state that has, no racial disparities in their criminal justice system. We don't have that. But we do have states that have, like, say, a great drug court program, great drug court model. States that have even, like, great juvenile court models. And to me, that's where the experimentation comes in, right? We can actually states can learn from each other. There's a state that's doing something really great, that's having great successes. We can borrow those things. And some of that has been happening, but it's been happening on a really low level, even self-funded often level. So a project that I'm working on right now, I've been going across the country, interviewing federal district judges on how they sentence, like what are they trying to do, what are they trying to accomplish, and having these interviews with them. And when I was in, I want to say this is Charleston, a judge there was raving about his drug court. He even invited me to sit in, and it was really neat. But he kept saying, if only they would give us more resources for this. This is so great. They're telling us, giving us these awards, but then nobody gives us any resources for it. And the reason is because our default is incarceration. We put our money there, and then we just sort of let little programs, come up that people have to find funding for. And it really ought to be the opposite, right? The idea that if these programs are working, that should be the focus, that should be the shift. And we're just not there yet, right? But there are examples around the country of programs, just kind of neat things happening that usually often kind of stay isolated in the part of the world.
You showed the one graph of the different countries. How do we compare crime-wise?
Right, and that was you also asked me about comparing to countries. Yeah, so I'm going through my head of all the other graphs that I have that I could show you, but I won't take the time to find it. We are there a while ago, let's say 90s. If you take a look at our incarceration rate graph, it goes up. I don't know if there's something I could write with. I'll show you. No big deal.
Computer, I think there are a couple of ways. I don't know.
Well, that's okay. You guys can just bear with me doing it like this. All right. Incarceration up like this, right? The place where it goes really high starts in the 80s. It's just like a big, huge spike up. Our crime rates at the far end, they're up here, and they start to go down. So we're actually in a time when we have our crime rates going down. It's been at least two decades since, It's been about 2 decades since we got past that optimal point. So it looks like this with years. These are years. These are like number of people incarcerated or number of crime rate. Our incarceration looks like, and then it goes like that. With this being the 80s, that's war on drugs time. Our crime rates look like this, and then they're like that kind of. So if you're doing like, statistics and all that, which that's not me at all, as an English major, around here you're like, this was the sweet spot. If you actually think the incarceration had anything to do with the crime rates, and there's lots of stuff that says these actually aren't really closely connected at all. But if you think so, then this is where, we should get back to, but we're up here, right? So that's one thing to answer your question.
What is the gap, like, between, the crime rate and the...
Yeah, I can't answer that. I don't know. It goes back to the English mind. I wouldn't even know how to tell you what that gap means. But all I know is that people who look at these, who like study these, say that we keep going up, crime rate is going down, but that the relationship here is not a strong one. That we can't find the correlation between longer periods of incarceration and reduced recidivism, and that in fact you're starting to see studies that do the opposite, that say the longer somebody's in prison, the more likely they are to recidivate. So on an individual level, we're not seeing the connection, and then also just on like a economic and statistical level, we're not seeing it. When it comes to other countries, the countries that are near ours, let's see, I'll go back to it. Yeah, but just so that everybody can recall. So for some of them, Russia, Iran especially, it's difficult to say. So it's difficult to know whether we should trust their numbers. They have high crime numbers, higher than what we report. But there is some mistrust, I guess, because they also have very long like pre-trial detention periods. A lot, just it's hard to know. But comparing the U.S. to Canada, France, Japan, crime rates are a lot lower. However, you might say, well, that's why we need more incarceration. Studies now are showing that, number one, that there may not be that much of a relationship, but also that that their crime rates are lower because they've used different types of punishment, right? And so they've seen the decades benefit of approaching punishment differently. So they actually deal with recidivism in a way that we don't. So there's all these things, so many ways to read them. But what we definitely know for sure is that we are the leader in the world of incarceration. That's absolute. Nobody questions that. No, really no opposite view on that one.
Like, how are we compared to crime rate?
We're not the highest crime rate at all. Lots of other countries, so Russia, China, but also countries, several African countries, unfortunately, due to political unrest, right? Several countries in South America, again, where we have a lot of drug crime issue. So if I had a crime rate graph like that, we'd be near to the middle. We wouldn't be at the far end. But again, you have to keep in mind that how you measure and report crime rates also has to do with what you criminalize. That all plays into it. So it's a hard question to answer, I guess. And then I did want to say, Professor Timmons asked about comparison to other countries. That there are countries that do punishment way differently than us, and some of these on the far end are one of them. But one of probably the one that is like up there at the top as a model is Switzerland. So this is kind of Norwegian model of punishment. Prisons look completely different, and they're more camp-like. They're really reserved for certain types of offenders. Other offenders do other types of programming, and their crime rate is very, very, very low. So, yes.
Do these incarceration statistics include like reincarceration, so people that have been incarcerated who committed very similar crimes?
So this is currently incarcerated people, which means it's going to be people at whatever stage. So they can be first-time offenders, they can be repeat offenders. This is just basically at any given time, how many people do we have essentially, warehoused in an institution? And so at any given time, we're at the top. And that's why people like to give this statistic or make the statement, the U.S. is 5% of the world's population, but we hold 25% of the world's prisoners at any given time.
Without asking you to give the actual statistic, do you know how we rate in terms of recidivism? We're fairly high compared to other countries on that?
All right, a big question. Let me think. We have a high recidivism rate. I haven't seen, so not every country measures recidivism or keeps track of recidivism in the same ways that we do. Countries that tend to report low crime rates typically have low recidivism rates also, but I can't give you the numbers. But what I can say is that pretty much everybody, both sides of the aisle, this isn't a political view in any way, say that we have high recidivism rates in this country, which is why things like drug courts were developed, mental health courts, the idea of trying to stop what they call the revolving door. The problem is that we don't invest enough in them for those to be our main way of dealing with certain offenses. They're sort of the one-off, the offshoot, the lucky person who gets to go that route.
Yeah, with the privatization of the prison system, you want return customers. You want repeat customers
Well,
like any business.
So that's a good point. I didn't know which way you guys were going to go. I was just letting the questions come in. I'll tackle them as they come. But so it's two ways to think about that. On the prison side, especially with privatization, the way it often works is that a state, some of the locale, will contract with a private prison, and in the contract, the private prison has to stay at a certain level of capacity. It's usually like around 90%. That is from the private prison standpoint. That's their demand. You have to send us enough so that we stay at least at 90%, or else it doesn't make sense for them to be doing business. So usually the way it works is that they kind of get the first customers, right? First people in, we make sure you're full, and then we deal with our own things. But you can already see the incentive, the perverse incentive that creates. But there's a problem on the other side too. So the drug court model. So to just, I think it's great. Like I said, I do think that it should be more of the main way of treating certain offenders. But on that model, there's also reason for cherry picking because they don't have a stable budget that's always funded by the state. They rely on donors, people who want to see success. They only pick people that they really think will be successful in that program, which keeps it very small, unlimited beds, right? So if you are somebody who's come through before, you're out. You can't come in again. If you don't fit this type of profile, if you don't have adequate family support, all these other things that if we, think about on the racial dimension as well, if your family doesn't look this way, if you don't have this kind of, people with jobs at home, if you don't have this or that, so we have a racially skewed and socioeconomic status skewed model, but there's incentive there as well. So as long as we kind of divvy up this kind of privatization, we have those sort of incentives.
Are there race-based patterns in terms of not only when of sentence, but where someone serves his or her sentence? In what type of prison they're sentenced to? How far away from family?
That's an interesting question, but I actually don't know. Something to look into. I don't know, but just anecdotally, so anecdotal stories. If somebody is convicted, they're sentenced. Sometimes they can ask as the defendant, typically through their attorney, to be sent to a specific place. They're trying to stay near home and things like that. Judges don't have to follow that. The Bureau of Prisons, at the end of the day, is really the one that's sort of in charge of dealing with all that. I have heard stories of defense attorneys who just never bother to explain to defendants about that, never ask about that. Whether it has a racialized component, I don't know. What makes a defense attorney care to talk about that, to not talk about it? Maybe it has something to do with how they see the person. Maybe it has to do with them being overworked. All sorts of things. But so I don't know. But I at least have heard that not everybody gets the benefit of having this long discussion about where the place of incarceration, what that really means, right? To your family, can they see you? All that sort of stuff.
You add that to the statistic about 1 in 4.
Yeah. When you really, statistics are numbers, right? And what I hope to at least have gotten you to do a little bit is to think about the people behind the statistics. Like, what is this really like? What does this really mean? How staggering is that to say 1 in 4 children will have a parent gone from home by the time that they're 14? What does that mean to your life as a child, right? And if your parent is incarcerated far away, which is more likely in a more rural environment where prisons are spread out, then you're not gonna see your parent. We were talking with the dean about costs of things like making phone calls in prison that your family has to pay for. I was like, $1.50 a minute. It's just things that really price people out and have this huge effect on just really, communities and people. And so it would be one thing, let me say, if we could say what we were doing, if we could say that our levels of incarceration are keeping crime down, that our levels and types of incarceration are, putting people on the straight and narrow, that if we really had, results, that would be one thing, right? But to do all of this and not even be able to point to what we're gaining, what we're doing well then we're just destroying families and communities and people and just going about our business every day doing that. And to me, that's very disturbing.
Did you go over how many people were incarcerated from like a family of like one parent or a parent that's been in prison?
So I don't have statistics on that, but you are disproportionately, and this is across races, disproportionately more likely, that way, to go to prison if you've had an incarcerated parent. But that's, not surprising, right? Because we just talked about family breakdown, about just the difficulty of growing up in that way, having, sort of economic opportunities when you don't have that, when your family is broken up in that manner. And so that is, that is a bit of it. We see a cycle of incarceration as well, which probably is why it allows people to sort of put this to the side and not think about it too much, because it tends to involve, families that are not ours, or, people that we've just heard about, or that's the other people's family. But if we look at these trends, right, this is getting just bigger and bigger. And so at some point, it will be much closer to home than perhaps it is now. Your hand was up again, I think.
I was going to ask you that question.
Okay.
But it is interesting to think of those kinds of statistics, because you could then wonder if, as quickly as your parents incarcerated, how much sooner are you likely to be incarcerated yourself? If your parent commits a crime and you're 14, are you going to be in jail by the time you're 17? Or if your parent commits a crime, will it wait until longer when you're an adult before you can be incarcerated? It's just kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, and while you're saying that, I'm writing these down, because these are things that I want to look to and, to see if I can find some of that information in your point as well. But yeah, and so again, if we can say that we're getting some overall community benefit from how we punish, that's one thing. But since we can't say that, and then on top of that, we're creating these cycles, then we really have undervalued those individuals. And really, in my view, we've undervalued ourselves, right? We're basically saying that we don't really care that much about the fabric of our own sort of broader communities.
So the one slide you brought up, it gave me a lot of pause, was that 1 in 3 blacks, 1 in 6, and 1 in 17 whites. Right? I believe those were all males, right? 1 in 3 black males.
Yeah.
So that kind of led me to another question. Is there also bias against gender in our American judicial system? Are there more males in prison for misdemeanors than females?
Yeah, there is. So there's a gender bias in our system as well that goes to the detriment of males. So when you look at statistics that show men and women who have committed the same offense with the same types of characteristics, men go to prison more often than women. There are a few reasons given for this. There is the implicit bias aspect of it, with the view of men as more dangerous and to see women as more genteel, right? That they just sort of believe in their future a little bit more than the men. There's also the family aspect of it, and so the idea of which is stereotyped as well, or biased as well, right? Because men have just as much of an interest in wanting to be near their children and stay at home, but women tend to get the benefit of that if you're raising children, and the thought is we'll try to find other ways to deal with you. But that's what we could be doing for everybody, right? If we really value everybody's family, everybody's community, then we really can say, like, okay, let's think about ways to deal with this. And, you have the person who is the violent criminal, who is dangerous to society, and that's one thing. But that's actually not most of our incarcerated individuals.
What are most of our incarcerated individuals like?
Yeah, I have some data on that. I don't have it on my slides, but I'm just trying to think if there's something I could get to really quickly to show you. No, because I just have a thumb drive and not my actual computer. Okay. All right. So mostly. None of these do it. All right, so mostly, and I'm saying mostly, but nothing is really over 50% because they kind of break down. And this also varies by jurisdiction, so in some places it's different. But if we're kind of looking nationally, we have a lot of property offenses. that people are in prison for. So thefts, burglaries, different types of larcenies. These come in different fashions, right? So they're not all, some of them are big, some of them maybe with firearms. But when we actually look at our level of violent offenses, meaning where there was a victim, an injured victim, then those are a smaller category than our property crimes. And then we have drug offenses, which some people call them victimless. It just depends on your view on drug crimes and who they hurt and all that. But drug crimes are about 30% in sort of nationwide. So if we're sort of breaking it down that way, your violent crimes are 10%, or sometimes even less, depending on where you are. Yes. Yeah, so there's something going on now called evidence-based sentencing, and it's used a lot for probation. And so these are these predictive models, the idea that we can use some factors, and if people have these different factors, we can kind of figure out their possibility of success on probation, their likelihood of recidivating. I mean, I like it in theory, in idea. I mean, in my view, the more information we have and that we can use, the better. I don't like it on an individual basis, right? Because the more that, because I think right now the models are imperfect. Some are more sophisticated than others. Different states use different ones. In Ohio, where I teach, they use the Ohio risk assessment system. And so, you're just plugging in numbers about like years of employment, education level, do you have substance abuse and stuff like that? Well, I do think that those are predictors, and studies say that. I think that sort of individual circumstances matter more than a lot of these numbers. And so I think people end up getting swept in, or in this case, really swept out, because these are instances of when you can be on probation and when you'll have to be sent to prison. People end up being pushed out of the probation when I think that they might have been able to be successful, but for the model.
So some people argue that mandatory minimums would even out racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. So I want to know what your thoughts are on that and why.
No, quite the opposite. So when I talk tonight about war on drugs, so for those of you who aren't, up on this lingo, mandatory minimum sentencing is basically, if you commit a certain offense, then if the law says you have to serve at least X number of months in prison. It's your mandatory minimum, so judges can't go below that. They're bound by law. A couple of things about that, though. That's based on the charged offense and conviction. So where you see disparities come in is where prosecutors will just not charge the offense that triggers the minimum for some people and charge it for others. That has been and it's well documented. U.S. Sentencing Commission has spoken about this again and again. That is very much racially biased. There's a huge racial component to that. And so while it might seem like, a minimum, that would make things absolutely fair, right? Because everyone's going to have to at least spend this much time in prison. Because it's only triggered by the charge, that's the place where you have the discretionary decision. So you just don't do it, right? Don't charge the 5 grams of crack, charge the 4, because that doesn't have a mandatory minimum, right? And so so the opposite has been true. And that is something that I'll talk about tonight with the war on drugs and giving you kind of the backstory of how it came to be, especially the kind of crack, powder, cocaine disparities that are in the law. This is an interesting story, I think, anyway. So I'll reveal more of that tonight. But yeah, any place in our system where there's the opportunity for discretion, there's the opportunity for bias, even by the most well-meaning person, right? And so that's a part of the issue. So if we have that, and we have, ways to try to deal with that through trainings and things like that, I guess I should say that all of this, I think, there are lots of things that need to be done to help this. The purpose-focused sentencing is just one slice of solution. So we have to deal with all these other things. But as we're trying to sort out those other things, at least one thing we can do is to say, why, like for this mandatory minimum sentence, why did we set it at that? What was the point? Behind most mandatory sentencing laws, the point is a political one. They're usually driven by some sort of political capital that was gained at the time to be tough on, some sort of offense. We see it now with just in the opposite, with like the heroin epidemic. we've just come into an era in sentencing of rehabilitation speak, right? So heroin offenses, we're saying, okay, epidemic, let's try to rehabilitate. But at the same time, one point is keep in mind that only some people can get to be in those rehabilitation programs. But at the same time, we're still saying, but for these other offenses, right, this mandatory minimum is in place, and we're not going to question how we deal with those, the ones we haven't called an epidemic. Well, does that make sense? Right? Just because it's not called the epidemic, does that mean that we just don't pay attention to how we sentence there? We only do it once it's on our radar? To me, that just seems short-sighted. It seems reactionary, and it's how most of our sentencing laws have come into play. I don't know where we are in time, but I have my own personal question. Some of you have kind of answered this for me, I guess, but were any of these statistics like new and surprising to anyone? Things that you hadn't seen before? Okay, just wondering. All right, I'd like to get a little read. Well, I'm happy that I was able to share these things with you and give you some different perspectives, some different things to mull over and think about. I'm going to say this tonight, but I'll say it now since I have a small group. It's easy to hear these things, kind of, feel like, oh, that's pretty messed up, and then kind of feel like, oh well, back to my life, right? I'm kind of back to school. But I actually do think that there are things that all of us as individuals can do, because all of this, number one, is put into place by our own legislators, our own elected officials. And if we made that a priority in how we decide who we vote for, if we spoke up and said that we actually care about sentencing as issues, then they get on the radar and we get to have discourse about them. I say that sentencing operates in the shadows where, most of us, here's a question I like to ask. Does anybody know what somebody can be sentenced to for any offense in this state, other than, you can't say murder, but anything? Yeah, right? It's because it happens all day, every day, but we just don't pay attention, right? It uses our money, it affects our communities, but we just don't pay attention. So I think also things that we as individuals can do is just educate ourselves. Courts are open, right? They're free to the public. You just go in, take some time, sit in on a sentencing, listen to what's going on, so that it starts to be something that you see as an important issue, and then you can speak with your vote in that way as well.
I should point out that it's Constitution Days here
All
in St.
right.
Francis. Professor Molesky is heading that up, so get out there, register to vote, and make a difference on this issue.
Yeah, and sentencing reform, by the way, is a bipartisan effort. The reforms that have been happening in the last 10 years, both sides of the aisle, because of money, mostly. So even if people don't agree on the ultimate goal, at least you can say something needs to be done, and we can start to think about outcomes, and start thinking about and talking about them in a more meaningful way.
Is this a problem of like a one-size-fits-all approach to?
Yeah, I think so.
crimes?
I think it's also twofold. So the one-size-fits-all, but that really comes from our own history. We've adopted our model from the British system, and it's just what we just took it, and we're just like, okay, we'll just keep going with this. So not only have we not individualized sentencing more, but we also just haven't even questioned our model. But there's a lot more to it. It's big business, so a lot of people make money from the prison industry. It's politically dangerous sometimes to seem like you're soft on crime. So there's a lot more to it, but that's at least one bit of it.
So let's all thank Professor Exum.